Okay, so in this unit, I want to talk about some challenges to morality or challenges to ethical theory. Um, and the two ones I'm going to be talking about are egoism and cultural relativism. And I'll explain with each of these a bit more why I think it's a challenge to morality as we usually think of it, and, how much of a challenge it really mounts. Um, so the first of these, when we talk about egoism, by egoism, I mean this idea that people are or should be self-interested. Now, you might be thinking that's pretty vague. Isn't there a difference between are self-interested and should be? To which I would say you're right. But, before I get into that, and I do think it's important that we narrow down what we mean by egoism, before I get into that, it would be good to say just a little bit about the challenge that egoism presents to morality as we usually think of it. I mean, look, think of it this way. It's pretty simple, right? It's not too hard to think of cases where what seems to be the morally right thing to do, what's pretty clearly the morally right thing to do, means that we would have to sacrifice our self-interest. We would have to do something that's not good for us, right? Think of a pretty simple case. You find a wallet and it's got $500 in it. Well, what's in your self-interest? Well, unless you're a lot better off than I am, probably to take that $500 and say nothing, right? What's the morally right thing to do, especially if, say, the person's driver's license and ID's right there and it's not too hard to get in contact with them? Well, the right thing to do is to get in contact with this person and get him his wallet back, right? But look, doing the morally right thing, not only would you have to give up the $500, well, you would have to take all this hassle of getting in touch with him, meeting him somewhere. So, look, it's not going to be in your self-interest to do what's morally right here. And I'm going to bet, it's not too hard for you to think of cases where, again, the morally right thing is clear and it's not in your self-interest. Okay. So then let's the idea that people are or should be self-interested seems to run into this idea that morality requires us to, at least in some cases, sacrifice some of our self-interest. Well, how much of a challenge then does egoism present to morality? Well, on that one, we need to be clear what we even mean by egoism. Remember in the lectures on argument, talked about the fact that a lot of times we might use a word in different ways. This whole thing about equivocation, and that might throw us off. Well, it turns out that egoism is a word that gets used in a lot of ways. So let's break down two main ways that it gets used. When we talk about egoism, we might mean ethical or rational egoism, or we might mean psychological egoism. I mean, honestly, we could probably slice it a little finer than this. I won't get into it. We could maybe even split off ethical and rational egoism. I'm going to treat them as the same. And as you guys will see, psychological egoism can itself, and it will be necessary to break it down further. But let's first say what we mean by these two forms of egoism. Ethical or rational egoism is a claim about what people should do. It says that people should be self-interested or selfish. Psychological egoism, on the other hand, is a description of what people are supposedly actually like. It says people are actually selfish or self-interested. We'll talk about each of these, but I hope you guys already get a sense that they're different. Okay, so the one I want to talk about, focus on in this lecture is ethical or rational egoism. We'll talk about psychological egoism in the next lecture, but at least in this one I want to talk about ethical or rational egoism. So, ethical or rational egoism says that people are or should be self interested or selfish. The right thing to do, what you should do, ethical or rational egoism will say, is whatever is in your self interest. That is the right thing to do. Now, I'm going to guess that you are already probably, hopefully, you're already pushing back on rational or ethical egoism, right? You can probably, if you are a sane, normal person, think of all kinds of cases where what's in your self interest isn't the right thing to do. Keeping the wallet, for instance. Why in the world would ethical or rational egoism say that the right thing to do is what's in your self interest? Well, look, I don't think that ethical or rational egoism is ultimately going to be a terribly good theory. I don't think we should buy it. I don't think it's plausible. But I think we should ask ourselves, why might it even seem plausible? Why might this seem like a believable claim? And it seems like a believable claim, I think, for this reason. And that is that all other things being equal, the fact that something is in your self-interest, in my self-interest, is a reason to do it. It justifies doing it. Let me give you, what do I mean by justify? Well, I mean it makes sense. If someone told us, if we ask somebody why they do something and they tell us, how and why it was in their self-interest, in a lot of cases we'd say, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Think of it this way, right? If I tell you, well, I just spent an hour on the phone with the radio station, and you're like, why in the world would you do that? And I'm like, well, they had $1,000 cash giveaway and tickets to a concert if you were the 17th caller, and I was trying to be the 17th caller, and you know what I was, and I got these tickets and that money. That would make sense. You would say, okay, I see why you just spent an hour on the phone doing that, right? It makes sense of what I did. It justifies it. Or if I ask you why you spent all day doing some job you don't like maybe, and you say, well, yeah, I got a really good paycheck for it, that would make sense of why you did it, right? So all other things being equal, the fact that something is in our self-interest is a justification. It makes sense of doing something. Well, here's the problem, though, and that is that all things aren't all things aren't equal in a lot of cases. Or to put it another way, ethical or rational egoism would say that the fact that something is in our self-interest is always a justification. And that's simply not true. A lot of times, someone might tell you a story about how something he or she did is in their self-interest, and you might just say, no, you didn't have a good reason to do that. Let me give you an example, right? So, many years ago, I had a friend who offered to help me and another friend move, right? My other friend was the person moving, but I was going to help him move, so if this other guy showed up, it would be less work for all of us. It was a nasty summer day, 90 degrees, humid. I don't know if you guys have ever moved in weather like this, but it's awful, right? Not only is it hot, you're sweaty, everything slips from your grasp. It's just not fun. Well, lo and behold, our friend, maybe I should put this in scare quotes, who was supposed to help us move, he just didn't show up that morning, right? He didn't show up, and he didn't answer his phone when we called him. And I don't know what excuse he gave, but it was pretty clear why he did this. Who wants to help someone move on a 90-degree day, right? When he said he'd do it, it was way cooler. It wasn't such a big pain in the neck. So why do it, right? But if this guy had the nerve to say to us, it's like, well, look, I know I promised I would help, but I got up, and it was 90 degrees, and I'm like, well, what's in it for me? Maybe I'll get dinner and some beer out of it, but that's not worth working in 90-degree weather. So even though, I promised you, I saw it really wasn't in my self-interest, so I didn't do it. So you guys see what I did was justified. You don't blame me, right? Had he said that, of course we would have blamed him. Like, no, that was not a good reason to break your promise. Especially wasn't a good reason just to not show up. The fact that it's in your self-interest isn't a justification here. It doesn't make it the right thing to do. Or let me give you guys another example, right? If someone gets caught for murdering, say, his cousin, who was, let's say his cousin was first in line for an inheritance and he was second. If at trial he says, well, I didn't really like the kid, and that was a lot of money, so you see it was in my self-interest, we wouldn't think that he had a good reason to kill his cousin, right? So ethical egoism, saying that it's always that the right thing to do is what's in your self-interest, there's just no reason to take it seriously. There's no reason to think it's true, right? There's all kinds of cases where it's pretty clear that the right thing to do, the justifiable thing to do, is not in someone's self-interest. And in light of that, ethical egoism or rational egoism would have to give us darn good reasons to think the theory's true, and it doesn't. Okay, so I want to move on to psychological egoism in a minute, but I do want to say a little bit about why psychological egoism is important. The reason I think it's important is I think if there's going to be a good argument for ethical egoism, it would have to rest on psychological egoism. Let me explain why. And in doing this, I'm going to introduce some principles that will be important throughout the class. So these are something to really pay attention to. Okay. So to understand why it is that psychological egoism could maybe give us an argument for ethical egoism. Remember, I said ethical egoism on its own doesn't seem to have any good arguments for it. We need an argument. Well, a good argument might rest on psychological egoism. Why is that? Well, the reason is it depends on something that philosophers call the ought implies can principle. And really, this is just a fancy way of saying should requires could. To say that somebody should do something, it has to be true that they could do it. If someone couldn't do it, it doesn't make any sense to say that they should do it. Look, I couldn't, if I told you right now, flap your arms and fly across the room, it would be crazy to say you should do that because you can't, right? If something's impossible, saying that we should do it makes no sense. This principle is going to be important throughout the class, especially when we get to Kantianism. This will come back up. But the basic idea is for it to make any sense to say somebody should do something, it has to be the case they actually could do it. If it's impossible, we can't tell the person they should do it, and we can't blame them for not doing it. Okay, so how's this important for arguing for ethical egoism from psychological egoism? Let me sketch an argument. Okay, so here's an argument for ethical egoism from psychological egoism. Premise 1. To say that someone should do something requires that they can do it, right? That's just the principle I talked about in the last slide. This should requires could, or ought implies can principle. So premise 2, just sort of a result of premise 1. So any good ethical theory should not ask us to do something that is impossible. 3, human beings can only act from self-interest. So 4, any good ethical theory must appeal to our self-interest. That is, it must be a form of ethical egoism. So look at this argument. Premise 3, I'm not saying you should buy this. I actually think this is going to turn out to be a bad argument. It's not going to work. But look, premise 3 is making this claim about what human beings can and can't do. It's saying that we can only act for selfish reasons. Well, that's going to be a form of psychological egoism. And so if that were true, if premise 3 were true, then it does seem to be true that any ethical theory, well, we can only act from self-interest. It would have to appeal to self-interest, right? Any ethical theory, if this argument works, would have to be a form of ethical egoism. Now look, some philosophers have bought this argument. Thomas Hobbes, who I'm not going to have you guys read, but fairly famous philosopher, he seemed to think this was true, and he offered an ethical theory that was basically just based on self-interest. He said, look, we'll all get more what we want if we have certain moral rules in place, so that's why we have these moral rules. Now look, I'm not going to talk too much about Hobbes, and one of the reasons I'm not going to talk about Hobbes is that I don't think this argument works. But what's going to be key here is whether premise 3 is true or not. Is it true that we can only act from self-interest, that we are necessarily selfish or not? If it's true, and this is a form of psychological egoism, if it's true, then I think ethical egoism will have to be true. We'll have to rework our moral theory to appeal to self-interest. But if it's not true, then I don't think we have any good reason to believe in ethical egoism either. So that's where I want to start with next lecture. Is premise 3 true? You guys can probably already guess, I don't think it is, but I also want to talk about what we even mean by psychological egoism. Let's get clear on that. Then we can come back and evaluate this argument, see what kind of threat to morality, as we usually think of it, egoism in any of its forms poses for us.